It's 1:38 a.m. Time for Octoberpod. Good morning. This is your host, Edward October. For those of you new to this channel, Octoberpod is the retro horror show for bold individualists. If you crave true-ish, and classic tales of the supernatural and horror, you've come to the right place. Before we begin, I recommend that you protect yourselves from vengeful spirits by subscribing to this channel and ringing the notifications bell with the buttons provided. We bold individualists must stick together in these ghastly neurotic times. Since the dawn of man, wizards, holy men, and spiritualists have used countless tools to communicate with the dead. From automatic writing to bleeding-edge EVP technology, no tool has been as effective at communicating with entities on the other side as the Ouija board, often to the user's peril. This morning's narrative is a true account submitted to us by Ghost-Free Gal and adapted especially for Octoberpod by MJ McAdams, creator-host of Humble Hauntings podcast. And our guest narrator is Sarah Heddins, co-host of the podcast Deadtime Storiez, with a Z. For your uneasy listening, then, we give you George and Ouija.
Good morning, Ed. This is up in Anchorage. I just discovered your show not too long ago, and I've been binging the episodes ever since. And actually, it's made me think about my own experience with the unknown. I haven't spoken of it since it happened, and it's starting to eat at me. Maybe if I tell it, it'll help me out somehow. You know, the truth shall set you free, right? It all started with my husband. We're divorced now, thank God. But let's call him George. George and I were high school sweethearts back home in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Got married right after graduation. I still don't know what we were thinking. We were too young. Neither of us really knew who we were yet or what we wanted. Looking back on it now, it feels like our marriage might have been doomed from the start. But things soon began to sour between us. George had certain bad habits that led us to marriage counseling not long after our second anniversary. He had issues with being faithful, but I wanted to believe that he could change, so I tried to fix things instead of just giving up on us. And for a time it worked. George really tried and took our counseling sessions to heart. We tried to get a fresh start by moving out of the city, settling in a lovely little house outside of town, and finding some peace. But that peace between us didn't last long. George had another problem besides the cheating. He had an obsession, I guess is what you would call it. He was a collector of occult artifacts. Now, I have a healthy respect for the paranormal. I know it is not something to mess around with unless you know what you're doing. My grandmother would always say to me, "Never open a door you don't know how to close." She used to apply that wisdom to all sorts of situations. And after she died, I heard all kinds of stories about her back in the old country. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Romania. Her side of the family immigrated in 1968. Apparently, she had been something of a healer or a wise woman, as some folks say. When George brought home the Ouija board, I heard Grandma's words echoing in my head as clear as day, as if she was warning from the grave. And I should have listened. I didn't put much stock in his hobby at first. To be honest, most of it was just crap he bought on eBay and Craigslist. But I knew enough about the occult to know that there was nothing of any danger in that room. But soon after we moved in, George visited a nearby antique shop, and he came home with the Ouija board. I had been in the kitchen when he first came home with it, and I still remember the hastily manner in which it was wrapped, as if the previous owner couldn't wait to be rid of it. George was beaming at me as he held it up. Technically, it was what you would call a spirit board, because it wasn't the mass-produced, brand-named Ouija board. This one was old and worn along the edges. The black lettering on it was half faded, and it had carvings of dancing skeletons on opposite sides of the board. At the very top was a picture of 2 eyes, and these eyes were dark and blank, like the eyes of something without a soul. They stood out to me because, unlike the letters, these eyes were a glossy, inky black, as if they had been painted on that very morning. And in tiny letters just above that, I read the name, Miss Ouija. The planchette, the piece you move across the board, was similar. Its design was faded, except for an eerie grin that stretched from one end of the wood to the other. Needless to say, I didn't like that thing one bit. I didn't want to look at it or even touch it. I only wanted that thing out of my home. It felt dangerous. If it could open a door to the other side, I was positive nothing good would step out of it. I told George to take the board back, but he only told me I was being silly. It was just a collector's item, and he wasn't even going to use it. And I believed him. That was my second mistake. Things slowly began to change. George was a freelancer long before everybody and their mom had to do telework. And George began to spend more and more time in his home office that he'd set up in a room that he'd fixed up above the garage. At first, he'd just be a little late to dinner, and he blamed it on his workload, said projects were just piling up. But eventually, George stopped coming to dinner at all. Now, I never bothered George while he was working, but something felt wrong. Sometimes I pressed my ear to the door, only to hear him laughing and talking with another person. I was positive that he was cheating again, so one day I lost it and I barged into the office. George was at his desk, like always, but he wasn't working. He was using the Ouija board. I was seeing red at this point. I think the fact that he lied to me about using that damn thing pissed me off more than the thought of him cheating. I was so blinded by anger that I didn't immediately notice the woman standing behind him. Only 2 things about this woman seemed solid. Her dark, hateful eyes, and the terrible grin, the grin that was spread across her face. Seeing my expression change from anger to horror, George dragged the planchette over the word goodbye, and the ghost vanished. Not into a puff of smoke like in the movies. It was like 1 minute she was there, and when I blinked, she wasn't there. Me and George fought all night over that Ouija board. I begged and begged for him to throw it out. Of course, he said I was acting crazy. Yeah, I was the crazy one. I asked him who he'd been talking to, and at first he wouldn't say, almost as if he was afraid to answer. But I kept on him until he blurted out, "She's dead. She can't hurt us. It was all just for fun." And then he promised he wouldn't use it anymore. That time I didn't believe him. That night I tossed and turned for hours before falling asleep. But at 3 a.m. I heard someone whispering right next to me. At first I thought I was dreaming until I opened my eyes to see the ghost standing at the foot of the bed, watching me. I shut my eyes, praying she'd just go away. Actually, when I was a little girl, my grandma had taught me to say the Lord's Prayer in Romanian, And that's the prayer I said that night. I waited for what felt like a lifetime until finally the whispering stopped. And then, just like before, she just wasn't there anymore. I was relieved that Grandma's prayer had worked and settled back down to sleep, and then, I'm not really sure how to explain it. She was hovering right above me with her face so close that our noses could have touched. I didn't see her hands on my throat, but they must have been around my throat because I could not breathe. And then I heard her voice shrieking, "He's mine," even though I don't remember her lips moving. She left a second after that, and as soon as I could breathe again, I screamed. George didn't even wake up. The next night, I went up to George's office, lit a couple of white candles and some sage to cleanse the room, and pulled the Ouija board down from the shelf. The eyes on the board were watching me. It was an eerie feeling in the stillness and the silence of that dry, dusty old room. But I placed the grinning planchette on the board and set out to try and communicate with this thing that invaded our home. "Who are you?" I asked. And the planchette started moving on its own, dragging itself to the letters scrawled just above those horrible painted eyes. Miss Ouija. I asked it what it wanted, and the planchette began to speed up. H-I-M. And I told it, well, you can't have him. The planchette began to move faster, repeating the same 3 words over and over. H-E-I-S-M-I-N-E. He is mine. He is mine. He is mine. I tried to drag the planchette over the goodbye, but it wouldn't let me. It felt like an invisible brick was stuck between the planchette and that option on the board. Strange. Right about then, I heard a shuffling in the far corner of the office and looked up. The room was only lit by candlelight, but I swear I could make out her figure. She was blacker than black. Darker than the darkness around her. And she was smiling. Just smiling at me. Her eyes were angry, and the figure seemed to float, I guess you could say. Yeah, she floated closer to me as the planchette kept spelling out, "He is mine." I wanted to scream and call to George, but I had a feeling he wouldn't come. And besides, I felt as if I couldn't scream. It was like being stuck in a night terror. So with all the force I could manage, I tried to pull the planchette to the goodbye on the board. My hand moved slowly, as if trying to push the planchette through wet cement that was starting to set. Miss Ouija was only 1 foot away from me. Her grin was wider than ever, and I remember feeling something on my face, like a puff of air or a draft. And I realized that I was probably feeling her breath on my face. Her hands were like slow-moving shadows, and they were reaching out to touch my cheek, and finally the planchette made its way to the goodbye. Just like that, she was gone, and I was alone in the dimly lit office again. I took a deep breath. I was still shaking like crazy. When the door slammed behind me, I screamed and just about jumped out of my skin. It was George. Only he seemed different. He was bigger, if that makes sense, and he didn't say a word to me. He just stared. I slept on the couch that night. I was too afraid Miss Ouija would come back. And I was afraid of George, too. I was afraid to be in my own home. As days went by, things got worse. I couldn't pass by my own bedroom without seeing the ghost's face watching me. George hardly ever left his office, and about a week later he walked in the kitchen when I was making breakfast. I offered to make him a plate, and he threw a stack of divorce papers on the kitchen counter in response. I was so shocked, and I stared at him for so long that I burned that whole pan of eggs. But I took the hint and packed up my things that afternoon. I called movers and booked the earliest possible appointment to move out. I was done. I called my friend Jackie, who lived 10 minutes away from us. I was in tears. She calmed me down, told me I could stay with her until I found a place, and I took her up on it. I wasn't going to spend another night in that goddamn house. Pardon my French. I was packing the last of my clothes when I found a pair of George's favorite blue jeans mixed in with my things. I wanted to throw them in the garbage, but I didn't. I can't tell you why I did what I did next, but before I could stop myself, I placed a hand in the back pocket. There was a thin slip of paper inside, a receipt to the antique shop that had started all of this trouble. At the top was the store phone number, and out of curiosity, I called it. An older gentleman answered the phone. I mentioned to him that my husband had bought a Ouija board off him, and the voice on the other line went silent. Then after a long pause, all he said was, "No refunds." I told him I didn't give a shit. Sorry, I didn't give a crap about any refunds. I just wanted to know where that thing came from. The story he told me is one I will never forget, and it hit a little too close to home. Turns out, that board had belonged to his niece. She was a psychic herself, like my grandma, and she owned her own little shop not too far from where I lived. She read tea leaves, tarot cards, and even palms. But she was especially known for her Ouija seances. That's how she earned the nickname Miss Ouija. But Miss Ouija had a problem. Her husband was a real big cheater. And one day he decides that he wanted a divorce so he could run off with his favorite mistress. But Miss Ouija wasn't having it. She refused to sign the paperwork, and when that happened, her husband became so enraged that he killed her. The shop owner didn't share any details with me over the phone, but I did some research, and I found out that she had cracked her skull open on a marble doorstep after her husband had pushed her down a long flight of stairs. Most of her prized belongings were buried with her, except for that board. No family member wanted it in their home, including the shop owner, but they believed it would be bad luck to just toss it out. So the shop owner sold it in his antique store, and he gave it to my George for just $1. Now, when I got off the phone, I don't know what came over me, but I marched right into George's office, I grabbed the board, and I ran all the way to the living room. It was winter, so I'd often light the fireplace instead of turning on the heater. I could hear George running after me, but he wasn't fast enough. I tossed the board and the planchette into the fire. I'll be honest, it felt so good to watch the flames lick at that wood. Only that's all that it did. It wouldn't f***ing burn. Language, I know. Sorry. I hope you're able to edit that out. Anyway, that board would singe, but it would not set on fire. The sound of George's running stopped behind me. In fact, everything was painfully silent as I watched the fire die out around the Ouija board. When the last flicker in the fireplace snuffed itself out, I was almost too afraid to turn around. But I did. The man in front of me was too hateful to be my husband. He looked at me with these strange, dark eyes that didn't belong to him. And that's when I noticed the knife in his hand. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, and I would swear to this on a stack of King James Bibles, I saw Miss Ouija standing behind him, whispering in his ear. Before the situation could escalate, I dashed to the front door, not looking back, not even breathing. I jumped into my car and started up the engine. George didn't follow me out of the house. He just stood in the doorway, expressionless. He watched me pull out of the driveway, and right before I sped off, he went back inside and shut the door behind him. I know this will sound foolish, like I'm just torturing myself, but I used to drive by our old house at least once a week, just to check on him, I guess, hoping that maybe he'll throw that damn board away and leave that house. But he won't. He never will. He's too hard-headed. And I never did see George in the window. Not once. The lights were always off, the curtain always drawn. But I do see her. Miss Ouija always knows when I'm around. She just stands there and smiles at me. Just thinking about it gives me the shakes. Now, all that was quite a while ago. I decided to start from scratch and move to Alaska. I've got me a Mongolian yurt and a bunch of dogs, and I'm happy to report that I have everything I need without a man in my life. But the same can't be said for Jackie, my friend who I lived with during the divorce. She's getting married next month, and I'm flying back to Pennsylvania for her wedding. It'll be the first time I've been back since all this happened. I'm sure I'll be driving past the house one last time while I'm in town. I truly hope George will be gone from that place. I know it's wishful thinking. Jackie says that, as far as she knows, he still lives here. Whether George is there or not, I know Miss Ouija will be in that window, grinning her wicked little grin. That smile that says she's won. Jesus. I'll never forget that smile for as long as I live. I guess that's why I have to go.
Play by the rules. Stay alive. The rules of Dash and Seek are quite simple. Drive together, stay together. Windows down with the music turned up. Never ride alone. But when Evie Larson and her friends reunite during a college break for some harmless fun, the game turns deadly. Fans of I Know What You Did Last Summer and Pretty Little Liars will enjoy this mystery thrill ride packed with dark secrets and unexpected twists at every corner. After witnessing a fatal crime, Evie and her girlfriend Tommy make a pact with their friends to stay quiet, but they soon discover that someone knows they are lying. As past secrets are exposed, they are each forced to play Dash and Seek once more. Stalked by an unknown threat, Evie is determined to unmask the killer before it is too late. But once the countdown begins, survival is not guaranteed. Dash and Seek, the shocking new novel by Amy Koto. Available now on Amazon.
Hey guys, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Stephanie.
And we're the hosts of
Deadtime Storiez.
Deadtime Storiez,
with a Z,
is a weekly podcast where we tell you stories of ghosts, hauntings, mysteries, conspiracies,
the supernatural, paranormal,
the generally eerie, spooky,
and all around weird.
If you like scary stories, witty banter, and classy broads,
we're your ghouls.
Gals.
Some of our stories include Eastern State Penitentiary.
No.
And where is it?
Does it some October? The Gettysburg Dime Museum.
They were like, show starts at 5, Mr. President. He was like, thank you, 5. No, Stephanie. He was like, thank you, 5. Fort Mifflin.
So the Americans burned down their own fort. They were like, oh, you
want this? You want this? Come and get
welcome
it.
to Philly.
And more.
New episodes are posted Thursdays at midnight on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and Stitcher.
Listen and subscribe, rate and review today. On the next Octoberpod, The Haunted Palace.